Hello everyone. Thanks very much, Ben, for the introduction and the opportunity to talk to you today. It's very nice to be here. So I'm going to be telling you about the research that we've been doing as part of the Beckley Imperial Psychedelic Research Program. And I'm going to talk about two main things, really. I'm going to focus on our most recent research with LSD, so a quite comprehensive brain imaging design where we used 3 different fMRI modalities, namely ASL, which measures blood flow, bold fMRI, which allows us to look at network properties, which seems to be especially important, magnetoencephalography, which gives us a higher temporal resolution than we get with fMRI. So we can get this more comprehensive, more complete picture of how LSD is working in the brain, and then we can compare that to other data as well and other drugs that we've looked at and other people have looked at. And I'll also talk at the end about our ongoing Psilocybin for depression trial. Seems to be going very well so far, so I'll give you a little update on our latest findings in that. Okay, so to begin with, I'll start with the boring stuff, but nevertheless important. So the design of our LSD study, we had 20 healthy volunteers, 16 males, 4 females. What's the best screen to look at? I think I'll look at this one. They were scanned twice, once on placebo, once on LSD, 2 weeks apart, and the order was balanced so that we can remove that confound from being a potential contributor to the results. And we can look at its effect as well. And the dose of LSD we gave was 75 micrograms. We gave it intravenously. That was really motivated by trying to abridge the experience so that it's easier to manage. We were also hoping that it might have a faster onset, which would be better suited for fMRI. But as it happened, actually, the dynamics of the LSD experience when given intravenously was actually quite similar to when the drug is given orally. So the onset is about it's about sort of 15 minutes to start really feeling something. So it is a slightly faster onset, but nevertheless it's quite different to psilocybin, where when that's administered intravenously, it's a more or less an instantaneous onset, the experience, whereas when the drug's given orally, it takes about 30 minutes for people to start feeling things. So the design was that we infused LSD or placebo, that was just saline, and then about 60 minutes after the infusion, we started the fMRI scanning. That scanning lasted for about 70 minutes. There was a break of about 30 minutes where we collected some subjective reports, and then the volunteers were set up for the MEG scanning. So it was quite a demanding day for the volunteers, but nevertheless we've accumulated all this data, and by and large, the drug was well tolerated. So just a very brief overview of the subjective effects that we saw with LSD. The intensity of the experience was relatively consistent for the ASL and bold scanning. It was slightly attenuated for the MEG. What's curious, I haven't ran any stats on this, but nevertheless, just eyeballing the data, I think you can see something there potentially. And it's that the hallucinatory effects of LSD actually seem to be slightly higher initially, and then attenuate as the experience went on. But if you look at some of the other aspects of the experience, like ego-dissolution, which I'm going to talk about in detail in a moment, then actually that seemed to follow a slightly different trajectory. So the intensity of the hallucinations was greatest earlier on, and then things flipped slightly, and the intensity of ego-dissolution was slightly higher and seemed to dominate the experience more. So I'm going to focus on this ego-dissolution phenomenon because it is particularly difficult, but nevertheless I think it's especially important. So what we did after the scanning, so after the MRI scanning and after the MEG scanning, was some semi-structured interviews where we asked some standard questions, usually quite open questions. One that we asked was simply, what was it like in the MRI scanner? And I was just sifting through some of the reports yesterday, And here's a report from one of the volunteers. He says that it was intense. I had a sense of being inside of myself and outside of myself at the same time. I definitely felt removed in some way from what I would usually describe as myself. So this, like I said, this phenomenon of ego-dissolution, ego-disintegration is very difficult to define, really. I think the best way to tackle it is to treat it as an umbrella construct or a constellation construct, meaning that it's made up of a number of different things, and it's only really when those are put together that you have this admittedly abstract and quite complex phenomena of ego-dissolution, which seems to nevertheless, characterize to a large extent the psychedelic experience, particularly a high-dose experience, and seems to be, again, to some extent, central to why psychedelics are interesting, I think, why they have profound effects on consciousness, and potentially also why they might be clinically useful. So this constellation construct is quite useful. We can look at different facets of the ego. We might look at something like reality testing. And if you have a difficult construct, or if you have any construct, if you can measure it behaviorally, then you're on a slightly steadier footing. What I'm going to present a lot of data about subjective ratings, but if you can actually measure something that people do or can't do, then scientifically you have something which actually is more objective. So reality testing is something we've looked at. We've looked at suggestibility as a kind of aspect of reality testing, and we found enhanced suggestibility with LSD, suggesting that reality testing, the ability to scrutinize and to be very discerning about the nature of reality, to perhaps do away with priming and suggestion and be sure in one's mind. That ability, which is probably tied up with the ego and its functions, is reduced under LSD such that you get a hypersuggestibility. But let's focus now on the brain effects that we've seen with LSD. And as a prelude to that, I just want to summarize some of the effects that we've seen with psilocybin. So with psilocybin, we used ASL as well, this measure of blood flow. Really, I think that's useful. Its usefulness, I would actually argue, is limited relative to some of the other measures that we've looked at. But its value is really in localizing the effects. And it was with ASL that we saw these decreases in blood flow, in particular hub structures of the brain, like the thalamus, and like these regions of the default mode network that you might have heard of, which seems to be probably the best candidate we have as a kind of system associated with one's sense of self or one's ego. So the finding that I'm showing here is reduced functional connectivity, essentially within the default mode network under psilocybin. And then we have our volunteers saying things like, that was real ego death stuff. I only existed as a concept or as an idea. So these kind of findings then motivate us to look again at these outcomes with psilocybin, but with LSD rather. And again, just to summarize what we found with psilocybin as an introduction to the LSD data, when we looked at the magnetoencephalography results, we saw a broadband, so a kind of general desynchronizing effect of psilocybin, such that all the different frequency bands that we looked at, we saw reduced power. That means that the amplitude of the oscillations, or the height of the rhythms, was reduced. So there was a kind of flattening of the normal rhythmicity and oscillations in the brain. Now, when we looked at a particular rhythm, which is a very dominant rhythm in the human brain especially, the alpha rhythm, and we looked at a particular structure which the fMRI results from psilocybin suggested could be important, and also in the context of other research seems to be especially important and related to high-level cognition and functions like consciousness. This posterior cingulate cortex region, which is, if you look at that brain there, it's actually the whitest bit, it's the lightest bit on that brain. So when we looked at the alpha rhythm within the posterior cingulate cortex, and we looked at the magnitude of the flattening of this alpha rhythm, it correlated very strongly, extraordinarily strongly really, with these ratings of ego dissolution. And we did what's good practice and what's necessary when you do these kind of correlations. We looked at the other ratings that we asked volunteers to complete as well to see whether they might correlate with this phenomenon. And they didn't really. There was one around the experience having a supernatural quality, so perhaps a kind of mystical aspect which did correlate, but the others didn't. And this was the item that correlated most strongly. So it survived what we call correction for multiple comparisons, essentially correcting for sort of fishing for a result. So it seems to be quite a robust result. This association between a decrease in alpha power and the experience of ego-dissolution. Another thing that's important with this finding is that alpha, as I said, it's a very dominant rhythm in the human brain, but it's also something which increases through maturation or development. So essentially it's not very prominent in infants, in children, and it increases into adulthood and is strongest around sort of early adulthood. And it's also strongest in humans. So our nearest relatives slightly reduced, and as you go down, you get less and less alpha. So it's suggestive that, like other systems in the brain, actually like the default mode network, that this seems to be associated with human cognition potentially. So that we see this sort of collapse of this alpha rhythm in a particularly high level cortical region of the brain is consistent with the idea. You know, we have a high level function in the ego, and we have these regions and systems and mechanisms associated with high level function that are essentially being knocked out, I suppose, under psilocybin. So the association makes sense there. So, okay, so that was your introduction before going on to the LSD data. And what about LSD? So just a reminder, we have our volunteers saying things like, I felt removed in some way from what I would normally or usually describe as myself. So the first thing that we did, we identified a number of brain networks. We actually did that on independent data so that we didn't bias our results. So we took a load of data from this project that's going on at the moment to look very comprehensively at aspects and facets of the human brain, the Human Connectome project. So we found these networks, we had identified these networks, one of which was the classic default mode network, and then essentially we looked at how integrated that network was under LSD relative to placebo, and we found what we predicted. So we saw a decrease in the integrity within this network, so you could say that's a disintegration, a decrease in integration within that network. And then we did the obvious thing, really, and that's to look at a correlation between the magnitude of that disintegration and people's ratings of ego-dissolution. When we did that, we saw a significant correlation. It wasn't especially strong, but nevertheless it was statistically significant. And then we do, again, something which is good practice. We look at other brain networks and we see whether disintegration within those brain networks correlate with this phenomenon, and they didn't significantly. So it seems to be a degree of exclusivity to the default mode network in terms of its disintegration correlating with this important psychological experience of ego-dissolution. Now, something else that we've done which is interesting, and we're currently sort of working into a paper that we'll submit, is we did a qualitative analysis of the subjective reports that people gave after their scans. So these interviews that we did after people were scanned, both with the MRI and the MEG, and then we used some kind of qualitative analysis. This was in collaboration with some researchers in Scotland, to look at how often people referred to their selves within a temporal context, whether they referred to themselves being in the past or in the present or in the future. And what we found when this analysis was run, so some busy students transcribed all these long interviews and did a lot of the legwork here, and they found that the prevalence of references to the self in the past were actually dramatically less under LSD than placebo. So under placebo, people typically do what you do normally, sort of reflect, think about what happened last night, that conversation with your housemate or whatever. So here's an example. I thought a little bit about a random incident that happened at work yesterday. Then on LSD, people were saying things like, well, you can imagine, lots of different colors, lots of animals, lots of lions. Then you might think, well, is this just effect of kind of inebriation or intoxication? Well, that's something that we could test by using this approach and doing interviews after different drugs. But if that was true, you might see an elevation in references to the self during the present, perhaps. But these references are reduced. And then it's intriguing to think, well, how might this is a kind of behavioral measure of sorts. And how might this relate to what's going on in the brain? So we ran a correlation analysis looking at the disintegration within the default mode network, and specifically those decreases in references to the self in the past, that kind of reflection, perhaps rumination, and we saw a significant relationship. So the greater the disintegration in the default mode network, the less often would people reflect on themselves in the past under LSD. So again, we're trying to tease away and sort of crack apart this very difficult constellation construct of the ego using different techniques in order to get a better handle on what it is. What's interesting when you think about the default mode network and kind of what it does, it's associated with reflection, introspection, some people say mind wandering, although that can be misleading. A study published in Science, quite a neat little study, which used something called experience sampling, where essentially randomly people are asked, what are you thinking about? And also, how do you feel? And when people did that, if they were outside of the moment and reflecting on the past mostly, then there was an association between that mind wandering and that sort of reflecting, that ruminative style of thinking, and negative mood. So it's interesting that if you're more, as is kind of promoted by, for example, mindfulness and certain sort of meditatory approaches, that if you're more in the present, you actually have better well-being. So that was found by this study in Science. And then if you look at the depression literature and you look at some of the phenomena associated with the default mode network and its properties, an association has been found between the strength of connectivity within the default mode network and the level or the magnitude of rumination in patients with depression. So the tighter the connectivity within the default mode network, the more patients with depression will be ruminating and the more severely they'll be ruminating. So there's that association there between the tightening within the default mode network and being removed from the present. Now we know with psilocybin, we know with LSD actually, that you see a reversal in that, so you see a decrease in the connectivity within the default mode network. This is another summary slide really showing that what we found with LSD is consistent with what we found with psilocybin. So we saw an association between ratings of ego-dissolution and decreases in the alpha frequency, and these are the regions where we saw those decreases, a more kind of global analysis here. Also the delta frequency associated with ego-dissolution as well. So there's some consistency there. Now, another thing that we did, we were quite motivated based on some very early research looking at the brain effects of LSD, some quite challenging experiments where they did things like record from actually within the brain, so very invasive. They're actually putting electrodes into the brain, into humans, usually patients with schizophrenia and this kind of thing. You know, a lot of that kind of extreme science that people were getting away with in the 50s. And then there was sort of very, although these descriptions are quite qualitative, probably because of the nature of the science at the time, it being quite primitive, there was an association between unusual activity within medial temporal regions and some of the sort of intense hallucinatory phenomena within an LSD experience. So we were motivated by this and a number of other results. For example, if you have resection or if you cut away the medial temporal regions, then people have attenuated experiences under LSD. Now that doesn't follow for if you have cutting away of the frontal lobes. So frontal lobotomy was actually associated with an enhanced or accentuated or an increased intensity of experience with LSD. So these things kind of suggesting that the medial temporal regions are important. There's also animal work, fMRI, showing that what you see in the medial temporal regions is quite different to what you see in the cortex. And actually, we've seen the similar things with both psilocybin and LSD. So those are the reasons we look at the medial temporal region and we ask a question: how does the communication, how does the quality of the communication between the medial temporal regions, more specifically the parahippocampus, how does the quality of that communication or the connectivity within that region to the rest of the brain change under LSD relative to placebo? When we ran that analysis, we saw a very marked decrease in connectivity between the parahippocampus and the posterior cingulate cortex that I talked about earlier, a high-level cortical region, which actually, under baseline conditions, normally does have very strong connectivity with the parahippocampus. So there was a kind of disconnect, a kind of split between these structures. And that correlated very strongly with ratings of ego-dissolution. The association here was actually stronger than it was for disintegration within the default mode network. So these kind of analyses help us to kind of finesse, kind of advance on our understanding of this association between the default mode network and ego-dissolution. We're looking at a specific circuit now and seeing this very strong association with decreased coupling within these structures and ego-dissolution. We've also found a similar thing with psilocybin, decreased connectivity between the parahippocampus and cortex, correlating with ego-dissolution, albeit doing a different approach to the subjective data. Now, what are these circuits? What is this system for? There's a very nice kind of seminal paper, really, that's talked about this default mode network and the posterior cingulate cortex related to what they call construction. They call it the construction system. This is mental construction, imagination, and similar phenomena. And again, just to kind of reiterate and rehearse this association between strength of connectivity within the default mode network, and particularly between the parahippocampus and the cortical regions of the default mode network, and being out of the moment, mind-wandering, daydreaming, thinking about the past and present. So the summary there: default mode network disintegration, collapse in posterior cingulate cortex alpha rhythm, and a disconnect between the parahippocampus and posterior cingulate cortex. All things that we found on psychedelics, suggesting that normally when these things are intact, we have a sense of self, you remove them, and you have this phenomenon of ego-dissolution. So it's a way of tackling something which I think is more important, believe it or not, if anything could be more important, than studying the science of the psychedelic experience, which is studying the science of the mind and the brain. It's a more general and important approach. We're just using psychedelics as tools to understand the mind and the brain. Now, onto the depression work for the last 8 minutes, 7 minutes maybe. Anyway, I'll get on with it. So depression, major problem, most costly brain disorder in Europe, leading cause of premature death through suicide, which of course is incredibly tragic and something that we'd like to do something about, of course. And 20% of patients are unresponsive to all treatments, so medications, psychotherapy, even ECT. These treatment-resistant cases, so very stubborn depression, and essentially they're at a loose end. Why not try psychedelics? Here's a little quote from a questionnaire survey that David and I ran, just suggesting part of the kind of motivation for looking at psilocybin in depression. Volunteers saying that there'll be several weeks after which I feel like I'm a brand new person after taking psychedelics, more so with mushrooms, followed by LSD. He says, magic mushrooms have helped me in many other ways as well. It lets me recognize some of the negative patterns in my life and change them. And no SSRIs can do that. So what about the design? Well, it's really a feasibility study. It's one of these, again, just treading carefully, walking before we run. Open label feasibility study in 12. They're treatment-resistant depression. They failed at least 2 different medications. Often they've had psychotherapy. One of our patients had tried ketamine and it hadn't worked. We give 2 doses of psilocybin, a low dose and then the high dose of 25 milligrams, which is up there with the kind of dose that Roland gives in his research, which is associated with these very profound experiences. Positive setting, of course. We do imaging before and after treatment, so not while they're under the effects of the psychedelic. We actually do the second scan the next day, so capturing the afterglow. And here are the results, the preliminary results. So these are different patients. We've dosed 7 to date, you can see that all have some decreases in their depressive symptoms. It's not a magic cure, these are very severe cases, and although we've managed to get 4, I think, by the last count, into remission, 4 of the 7, there are still patients who do have some depressive symptoms, but nevertheless the results are really encouraging and suggesting that the psilocybin is indeed working. In some patients, they've experienced entire transformations, really, of their outlook and their well-being. Another measure of depression, seeing decreases here in the classic BDI rating of depressive symptoms. These are statistically significant. I just haven't put the p-value there, but they are. You'll have to trust me on that. Also looking at anxiety scores, we saw reductions in them. One patient, no real change, but the others, we did see significant reductions. And as a group, there's a significant reduction in anxiety as well. And optimism. So interestingly, it's worth looking at, not just bad things that go down, but what about something positive that could go up? So we look at optimism. This is something that we looked at with LSD and saw increases 2 weeks after LSD. And so with psilocybin in these patients, we're also seeing significant increases in optimism 1 week after the high dose of psilocybin. As I said, we saw a similar thing with LSD. This paper is about to be submitted. So what about the mechanisms in the last 5 minutes? This could be difficult, but there's an association between deficient serotonin stimulation and perseveration or repeating behaviors, so a kind of rigidity in behavior in animals, so less stimulation of this important serotonin 2A receptor, which you should know. If you don't know, you should know is key for the mechanism of action of psychedelics. I wanted to skip over that to give you some new stuff, but if you didn't know that, you should know that, and so write it down. And so stimulation of 2A with LSD is associated with cognitive flexibility and learning enhancements in animals, and also this study showing increased cortical plasticity associated with serotonin 2A receptor agonism, which again may explain to some extent some of the antidepressant properties of psychedelics. So I think this is my last slide, and it's saying again that serotonin 2A receptor stimulation serotonin 2A receptor binding is up in depression, probably because of deficient stimulation of that receptor. So as a kind of homeostatic mechanism, it upregulates, we say, it increases in number so that it will get some stimulation. Again, deficient serotonin 2A stimulation, which comes from the 2A receptors being increased in their density, associated with neuroticism and pessimism in different studies. And if you block the serotonin 2A receptor, this is some nice work by Franz Vollenweider and another team in Holland. If you block the serotonin 2A receptor, then you won't get the positive mood effects. You don't get the psychedelic effects as well, of course. You don't get the positive mood effects of both psilocybin and MDMA. So the model here is about a deficient serotonin 2A receptor stimulation being associated with that kind of rigidity, as Ben was referring to earlier, in terms of what you see in a lot of psychopathologies, in addiction, in depression, that kind of sort of stuck way of being, whether it be repeated cycles of withdrawal and craving and addiction, or repeated cycles of pessimism in depression, and psychedelics may serve as a kind of reboot for the system. What could that map onto mechanistically in terms of the larger brain? Well, you've seen this, many of you have seen this nice image of an increased range of connectivity in the brain under psilocybin. We found a very similar thing with LSD, and actually it correlated with ratings of ego-dissolution. What I need to do, and what I just didn't have time to do, was to look at the association between ego-dissolution in our patients and their clinical improvements. But there's a prediction there that if people do report having this experience of ego-dissolution, then perhaps their resistance to the drug effects will be less, and perhaps their clinical improvement will be more. And it will be important to know that, and also having this background and this understanding of the mechanisms that might explain it. This slide's a little dry, so I think I'll just wrap it up and say thank you very much for your attention.